So the new Mythic gear system introduced with Season 14 of Diablo 4 has been a pretty big shakeup to the general balancing of the game, and was also one of the most disliked parts about Season 14, but not necessarily because the Mythic system itself was bad, because at the start of Season 14, obtaining Mythics, and more specifically obtaining Mythics of specific categories, was all but impossible. Now at this point in Season 14, they've done pretty much all of the changes players wanted, so now the Mythic system is actually pretty nice to use on Season 14. The Mythics you want to get, you have much easier and deterministic ways of obtaining them, but now after we've received the blog post for Season 15, we now know what they're doing with the future of the Mythic system. And that's what I want to go over in this video, because I have both some positive and negatives for this system, but I do think there is the potential that they are going to be implementing a higher or more interesting rarity above the Mythic rarity in the future of the game, and there's some very specific reasons that I think that is going to be the case. So I want to go over what the Mythic system is going to be in Season 15 and what I think this is leading towards. And I was going to go over the history of this Mythic system, specifically going into Season 14, but because there are so many big changes coming with the system in Season 15, I'm just going to go over what the Mythic system in Season 15 is going to be. So now in Season 15, every single item in the game that can either be a unique or a Mythic will be both. So going in Season 14, all of the unique items in the game got Mythic versions added that are essentially upgraded versions of their unique counterparts. But we still had iconic Mythics, which is the Mythics we've had in the game since they became Mythics. And in Season 14, they were iconic Mythics, which were still a bit different, even though they were technically still the same category. And there was just some weird stuff in the game because of that, them having a much lower drop rate than other Mythics, there being different crafts specific to iconic Mythics, and them not having a unique counterpart. So if your build needed those specific iconic Mythics, it just felt weird that they didn't have a unique counterpart. So going into Season 15, every single item is now just going to have a unique and a Mythic version. So they are adding unique versions of all of the previous iconic Mythics. They are also adding in 9 new unique items into the game that are essentially items from previous Diablo games, both 1, 2, and 3, and all of those are also going to have unique and Mythic versions of them. And the system is going to work in the same way across every single one of these uniques or Mythics. So you get a unique, they work like how uniques have pretty much always been working, besides having 2 random stats on them, but more specifically, they're not going to be the highest rolls possible. But then if you get the Mythic version of unique, its special effect will roll 30% higher, and all of its affixes will be the max rolls. So if you could roll 100 to 200 max life, it would always be a 200 roll. That includes if you re-roll that Mythic at the Enchanter, because that's another one of the big pieces of this system going into Season 14, that now all uniques and Mythics can have 1 stat re-rolled at the Enchanter, and every unique and Mythic in the game also has 2 statically rolled affixes on it. So every unique or Mythic you get will have 2 rolls that are always the same from first obtaining it, so you kind of only need 1 affix roll to get the best roll, except that's not necessarily true because it still allows you to roll the static rolls that come on the unique, but that's how the uniques and Mythics are going to work at a baseline. Now, another pretty big change to the Mythic system is how you are going to go about crafting Mythics. So now the Mythic craft in the Heraldric Cube is now going to be changed to upgrade to Mythic. So now let's say you get a unique item that you fully upgrade, you masterwork it, you temper it, you get everything on it except transfigure. You can then take it to the Heraldric Cube and upgrade it to the Mythic version of that item. It will be the Mythic version of the item you actually put in. It'll keep all of its upgrades, it'll keep all the modifications you did to it, but you can only equip 1 Mythic through that specific craft. That is the only Mythic craft in the game that will have a crafted tag on it, and you can only equip 1 item with that crafted tag, or 1 Mythic with it. So you do that 1 cube craft for your most important Mythic early on, and that's the only Mythic you can equip through that specific craft. Also keep in mind, as I mentioned, you can't transfigure an item and then upgrade it to Mythic, so make sure not to do that. But then the 2 other Mythic crafts are also going to be changing. So you have the mythic craft at the jeweler where you take some runes, you take some resplendent sparks, and you craft a mythic of a specific category. Let's say a helmet. Now going into season 15, these crafts will only be your class specific mythics. So if I go to the jeweler and craft a random mythic helmet, it will only be class specific helmets for your class. You won't be getting any generic mythics, you won't be getting any iconic mythics, and you will be able to equip as many of the mythics you craft from the jeweler as you want. You could go craft 5 mythics from the jeweler and equip all of them at once. There's no limitation on that. Then finally, we have the craft at the blacksmith. This one has also been changed to essentially be a pure RNG craft. It's presumably going to take the exact same materials, probably the 50 million gold and 2 resplendent sparks, and it will give you a completely random mythic item. It could be a class mythic, it could be a general loot pool mythic, it could be an iconic mythic. So any mythic in the game you could get from the random craft at the blacksmith to just use up those materials. And just like the jeweler, you can equip as many of those as you want as well. There's no limitation. You could go do 10 crafts at the blacksmith and equip 5 of those items and you're completely fine. There's no limitation on the jeweler or the blacksmith mythic crafts. Now, this isn't specifically part of the mythic system or the mythic gearing system, but they are also adding in mythic charms as well. And you can get mythic versions of any unique charms in the game. And you will also be able to get mythic charms of the iconic mythics. And presumably, because the iconic mythics are also getting unique versions of them, presumably you will also be able to get unique charms of, let's say, a grandfather. And on top of adding mythic versions of all unique charms, they are also adding in a bunch of new unique charms for existing items that weren't part of the unique charm system. So there are probably going to be a bunch of builds that change up what unique charms they are using because of this. But on top of all of that, there isn't really any deterministic way to get mythic charms. These are essentially going to be completely random, which I think is generally fine, because for pretty much all of the builds, the unique charm you're using, you're pretty much just using whatever has the highest damage increase you can get. A lot of the times you're not using your mythic charm for like some specific effect that you absolutely need. So having this much longer chase item of getting your mythic charms, I think will generally be fine, but this will also potentially make the highest of end of builds maybe want to use the mythic seal that allows you to use 3 unique or now mythic charms, because you could potentially get that seal, have 3 of the mythic charms you want, and then also have a 3 set bonus from set charms. And that may end up being the new meta. It'll just be pretty grindy to get those mythic charms. But that's the entirety of what the mythic system is going to be on season 15. And I think the mythic system is generally in a good place in season 15 based upon the mythic system itself. I do think there are some issues with this mythic system just existing. First off, and the biggest one that I see like nobody talking about, we have completely power crept almost all of the legendary aspects in the game. Because most legendary aspects for damage increases are like 60 to 70% depending on what specific one you're using. They're usually more on average like a 60% damage increase, but because we can just get mythic versions which have an increase of 30% for the special effects of uniques, you are rarely taking damage increasing legendary aspects now because there's probably a mythic that will just give you more. And in most builds, you're also only using 1 utility aspect, usually on your boots, and 1 defensive aspect a lot of the time being on your chest piece, unless you need like a specific unique of those slots. And I went through and looked at a lot of builds for a lot of classes. This is true for a lot of them. I mainly play the druid and I look through druid builds. Pretty much every single druid build I look through, no matter if it's the best build in the game or ones that could just do Torment 12, pretty much all of them are using all mythics besides like a pair of boots and a chest piece. So that is a massive problem. And I think this is just compounding an issue we've had since Lord of Hatred, because going into Lord of Hatred, the tempering system lost pretty much every interesting temper it has. It's now just base stat increases. And the legendary aspect system had pretty much all of its gameplay changing effects removed because they were going to be adding a lot of those and focusing gameplay changing elements to the skill tree. Now, I think both of these were kind of mistakes in how hard they went on it, because they removed every interesting temper, which we had a bunch of really really interesting tempers previously, like chances to double cast. We had increases to different passives, which don't exist anymore, but you could have just given that effect as an effect on the temper. Size increases to skills, a ton of other tempers that were just much more interesting than what we have now. And then for the legendary aspect system, now it's just really basic stat increases. So they either need a pretty substantial overhaul or additions to both of these systems, or both of these systems kind of don't have a reason to exist. There really isn't a reason for the tempering system to exist right now, because it's basically just another affix on pieces of gear, and most of them aren't really that substantial. They're basically just getting weaker versions of affixes we already have on gear, and almost none of them are unique to the tempering system. And for legendary aspects, like I've been mentioning, it's been completely power crept by the Mythic system, which is a problem because the legendary aspect system was legitimately the base foundational aspect of Diablo 4's gear customization. And they have kind of gutted it and now power crept it with Mythics, so they really need to do something both with the tempering and even more specifically with the legendary aspect system. Something needs to be done with it because, as I mentioned, right now they both don't really have a big reason to exist anymore. So that's one of the first big negatives of the Mythic system. The second one, which I don't actually think is a big negative when you actually look into this, but a lot of people have been saying they don't like iconic mythics just essentially being more uniques that are now also able to be mythics, because previously the mythics were the more chase items, and now there's unique versions of them, so they're much easier to get, and then they're just pretty much the exact same rarity or chance to get as all of the other mythics in the game, making them not unique to any of the other uniques or mythics in the game. But one of the reasons I don't really care about this and I don't really share that opinion is that now that they have made unique versions of the iconic mythics and the mythic versions of them are just normal mythics like all the other mythics, now that they have done that, so they will essentially have the same drop rate as everything else, I don't really share the opinion that these were like cool chase items to obtain, primarily because none of the mythics were actually interesting, or at least the mythics that were actually used. Back before Season 14, when the mythics were just the handful of mythics we've had in the game for a long time, those mythics were only big chase items because they were strong. And primarily because they gave more affixes and not like interesting affixes, and they gave big power increases. Air of Perdition was used for like every build in Lord of Hatred and was used for most builds in the game multiple seasons previous to that. The only reason Air of Perdition was used was because it gave a massive multiplicative damage increase just as a passive, and it gave a big crit roll on helmet where you couldn't normally get crit rolls. That was it. Nothing interesting about that. That is as boring as a rare item just with higher stats. Then you have the Grandfather. It's literally just a bigger increase to crit damage. That's all the Grandfather is. There's nothing interesting about that. That is as interesting as an upgraded rare item. It's even less interesting than a legendary piece of gear, because at least a legendary piece of gear, you have a legendary aspect you get to choose on it that can be more specific to build. So that's completely uninteresting. You have Ring of Starless Skies, which is a little bit more interesting because it has resource reduction on it, which allows you to change out other pieces of build, but the majority of Ring of Starless Skies is the multiplicative damage increase you get for using your resource and the attack speed and crit chance rolls you got on those because those rolled higher than normal rings. So again, most of that is boring. In fact, I think the most interesting, heavily used mythic was Shroud of False Death before it got nerfed, because it gave you +1 to all passives, even if you didn't have points in those passives. And there was actually some interesting things that could accomplish. Like specifically looking at the Druid had a bunch of lightning bolt proccing passives that you usually wouldn't go into very heavily, and if you went into it, it was because you were specifically a lightning focused build. But when you use Shroud of False Death and it gave you +1 to all those passives, you could actually change out one of your Paragon glyphs that gave a pretty big multiplicative damage increase to enemies by your lightning bolts, and those were just passively proccing because you got all of these free passive points. So legitimately, Shroud of False Death, the strongest mythic ever in the game, I think was actually the most interesting, and pretty much every other mythic that's used wasn't interesting like I went over. So them turning them into not really chase items above any other unique or mythic doesn't bother me because they weren't interesting in the first place, and a lot of the other generic uniques are more interesting, and a lot of the other class mythics are also more interesting. And I think the general positives of the Mythic system are that they do feel somewhat decent to get. Like when you get your class specific Mythic that you needed, that you then have good rolls on, especially earlier on in the season, that actually feels pretty good. And I do like the graphical style they went with the new Mythics, where it's animated on it and it looks almost like more space inspired. So it looks a bit more magical, a bit more mythical. So I do think getting the Mythics you're actually looking for do feel pretty nice. And since there's going to be unique versions of all of them, there isn't going to be an effect that your build requires to actually work that you have to get as a mythic item anymore. So I think the acquisition of Mythics is also going to feel pretty good in general. And because these Mythics get such big buffs compared to their unique counterparts, you are just using a bunch of items you weren't using previously, which for some builds does give you some more interesting choices. So I think the general acquisition and using these items like kind of at a baseline and obtaining them is pretty good as a system. Now, like I mentioned, one of the biggest issues I have with the system is the power creeping of other systems like legendary aspects. But saying that, that does bring me into the big thing that I think this system is working towards. Because even though I think the Mythic system in general is in a pretty decent spot in Season 15, I think it very much opens up the possibility of another rarity above that because of how the Mythic system actually is now. Because previously we obviously had the just Mythics. We only had a handful of Mythics. Those are much more rare than the other items. They had their own specific currency tied to them. They were a more rare chase item, even though they were kind of boring. But now, because every Mythic has a unique variant, Mythics are essentially a greater affix version of uniques. If you really think about it like that, greater affixes are a 25% increase to an affix, a mythic item is a 30% increase to its special effect, and no increase to its affixes. Even though they're max rolled affixes, it would still be much easier to go get like greater affixes on a unique version of it than get like a greater affix on a mythic version. So really all you're getting with a mythic is a 30% increase to its special effect, which is essentially just getting a greater affix to its special effect instead of its stats like how other greater affixes work. And because of that, and because of things like the legendary aspect system essentially being power crept primarily out of the game, not fully out of the game, but the legendary aspect system is definitely on its last legs because it's being so power crept. I just think because of all of this, there's a pretty decent chance that they want to make another rarity above this stuff as an actual chase item, maybe has some really cool effects on it. And while I really have no idea what they would do for a new rarity, but before that, we can actually take a look back at before Diablo 4 was released, because there is just a rarity that isn't in the game that was originally being developed for the game that could legitimately just be brought back and would kind of fit in the game now, which is kind of interesting. So if you go back early development in Diablo 4, they were working on a bunch of different rarities. Specifically, they would show these charts to where they would show a normal rarity, a magic rarity, a rare rarity. Then they had a legendary and set items as two different rarities, but they would be the same strength because originally they didn't want set items to be stronger than legendaries. You would just make a choice between the two. They obviously took sets and put them in the talisman set, even though they did add sets into the game later. Then there was ancient items and then mythic items. Now, ancient items were just going to be essentially what they are in Diablo 3, where they would be beefed up items of legendary or set items. So you could get a specific legendary and then you could get a specific ancient legendary. Now it's kind of interesting that in Diablo 3, an ancient item was an item with higher affix rolls, but its special effect was the same rolls, which is the exact opposite of what we just got with the mythic system. Because also back at this point in Diablo 4 development, there was no unique items and legendary items were essentially uniques. There was no legendary aspect system yet, so a legendary that had the effect on you wanted, you had to just go get that legendary. So it was kind of like Diablo 3 in that sense, but it is interesting that going from uniques to mythics is the exact opposite of ancients in that it doesn't increase your affixes, but it does increase the special effect. It's kind of interesting when we get into the mythic items. Now, mythic items here, you would think, oh, these were like their original designs for a mythic system now. But no, that's not the case. These old mythics were a different color and they were completely different. Old Mythics were the highest rarity, and you would only be able to equip one of them at a time, and they were going to have 4 legendary effects, and that's why you could only equip one. Now, I think back then there were also supposed to be how legendaries were working back then. If you wanted a specific mythic necklace, that specific mythic necklace would always have the 4 same legendary effects on it. Now, why this is interesting is because, as I just went over, the mythic system has power crept legendary aspects. And the 2 reasons for that being that legendary aspects no longer have gameplay impacting effects like they used to, so you don't need them for the build to actually work. Now they're just pure stat increases, and mythics are just now better in overall power increases. So you're not using many legendaries or legendary aspects now, but imagine they added this old version of mythics as a new rarity where you could get 4 legendary aspects on one item, but you can only equip that singular mythic item. That could honestly kind of help with legendary aspects being so power crept. You just get one item with 4 legendary aspects on it. Maybe you could change one or change a couple on it or something. And I don't necessarily think this is the best option for them to go with. I just thought it was pretty interesting that a bunch of their designs from back this far in the game were almost kind of brought back, but kind of flipped on its head. So like I mentioned, ancients that they were going to be doing that were similar to Diablo 3 are now kind of the mythic system. Just the things you're getting upgraded are the special effects instead of the aspects. And then because legendary aspects are now power crept, the old mythic rarity kind of makes sense again to add into the game. You have this one item that can have 4 legendary aspects on it. That would be much more interesting if we still had the special effects and gameplay changes of the old legendary aspect system that have been completely removed. But this is just an option that they could possibly do with a new rarity that I think was too interesting to not at least go over. And really one of the main things I wanted to kind of get out there through this video is that I think there's going to need to be some kind of fundamental changes now that the Mythic system is in the game, because they have to do something. The Mythic system has just power crept too much of the game, so they either need to go back, remove some power from that, and add stuff back into the legendary aspect system, or there needs to be another new rarity on top of that that adds something that's much more interesting into the game. So I am very curious what we see in the future of the game because of the Mythic system. And I very much don't think that we're adding in the Mythic system without having something in the future for the Mythic system to actually be added into the game. Because not only is the game kind of just ripe for a system like this to be added in, but I think if they don't, the game is going to get too boring. Even if they added a ton of uniques every season that would also be able to be mythics, I think the game would just be too homogenized around what's essentially one rarity. Because again, a unique item going to a mythic is essentially just a greater affix on its special effect. While they are technically different rarities, they're also kind of the same rarity. So I do think there will need to be some big changer on the system or some new addition into the game to make it much more interesting in the future. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.